Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in today's webinar here with Swayzer Landscapes. My name is Jennifer Vasquez, and I am the Water Policy and Resource Analyst with West Basin Municipal Water District. Very excited to have a few of these webinars available to the ocean-friendly staff members through the cities and also the school staff that help manage these gardens. So for today, I really will be the moderator, and any questions that come in would basically be entered through the questions section, and future recordings will be available on our YouTube channel as well, so that any resources that are needed for the ocean-friendly gardens are shared across your staff members that work in these great gardens. So without further ado, I won't prolong this too much. I will go ahead and pass it on to Llewellyn to begin the presentation and really tell us a little short introduction and go through the plants webinar for today's class. So Llewellyn, take it away, and thank you so much for engaging our class with this topic.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Ocean Friendly Garden Maintenance webinar series. Today we'll be talking about plant lifespan and replacement schedule. Like she said, my name is Llewellyn. I am the lead horticulturalist at Swayzer Landscapes. And so I'm excited to talk to you guys today about plants and the horticulture of maintaining these very specific gardens. So because this is the first webinar of this series, I will give an introduction to ocean-friendly gardens and exactly what that means. I'll talk about the criteria for ocean-friendly garden plants. Then I'll talk about the lifespan of ocean-friendly garden plants. And then we will touch on the replacement schedule. So, you know, when these replacements can actually occur. So the Ocean Friendly Garden is a collaboration between West Basin Municipal Water District and the Surfrider Foundation, along with the G3 Green Gardens Group. This ideal was introduced by the Surfrider Foundation to have ocean-friendly gardens by using the concept of having plants that are native to the Santa Monica Bay coastal region for residential areas and also other landscape areas. Surfrider's Sustainable Landscaping and Education Program is very helpful to this particular topic because they are a nonprofit organization put together by a group of surfers, and so they care a lot about the ocean and the things that go into the ocean more importantly. And so they have this whole program, and it's not just about ocean-friendly gardens, but they do have a certain section where they are dedicated to ocean-friendly gardens, and it's an educational program, and then they do garden installation, outreach, building awareness. There's educational workshops you can attend, and they're also pushing for policy changes. So, you know, tangible things that can happen to protect the oceans even further. Their main goal is to make a connection between how we care for our yards and public spaces, so landscapes in public spaces, and also the health and how it affects the health of our local waterways. And so because we are in Southern California, our local waterways are, you know, the Pacific Ocean. So, you know, a huge swath of local waterway. Like I said, you know, Southern California, one of our very charming features are the oceans, the coast that we have, that whole coastline. And so it is one of the joys of living in Southern California to be able to just go to the beach and have a beach day. And that is why ocean-friendly gardens are important, because we want to create these gardens to prevent contaminated water from reaching the waterways and eventually the ocean. So one of the main features of these gardens are no chemical sprays, so no inorganic fertilizers, no pesticides that will eventually reach the ocean, because Many times they often do. And not just the ocean, but other waterways. So we have rivers, there's watersheds, all kind of things where this water that potentially has, harmful landscape materials can reach the ocean. So runoff is the #1 source of ocean pollution. In fact, 80% of ocean pollution comes from activities that we do on land, and that is called non-point source pollution. And so that means that the pollution is coming from another source and then it's leading into the ocean. And so that is a huge problem because the ocean is very important to the world. It covers most of the earth. And so we have to make sure that we, in those small ways that we can, are cutting back on the pollution. And so it's very common. It's a very, very common occurrence to, have a beach day plan, walking to the beach, and you see a sign that says, warning, don't get in the water, you might get sick. And this happens very commonly after storm events. So we just had a rainstorm. And so basically all of that water that touched all of the surfaces drained into the ocean. And now the ocean has the ability to get whoever gets into it sick. So you don't want to put yourself in that situation. And so it's even more important to not pollute it. In fact, not just for swimmers and surfers, the ocean is important to everyone. The ocean covers 70% of the Earth's surface and it produces half of the oxygen we breathe. Oceans are crucial to sustaining life. There are so many ecosystems that are happening in the ocean, and it's all a balance and it's all a cycle, and we're all connected to it. We commonly learn, probably when we were kids, that all of our oxygen comes from trees and trees are providing our oxygen, but a lot of that oxygen is coming from the ocean. There are these microscopic plants called phytoplankton, and they do a lot of the photosynthesis that actually gives us the oxygen to breathe. So it's very important that we keep their environment stable by not adding unnecessary things that can harm them. And gardeners, we do affect the local waterways. And so these images are just some examples of how it easily happens. And this is a very common occurrence, especially when you're using overhead irrigation. So in these two pictures, we're looking at some runoff from irrigation that could easily be avoided, but it's an often occurrence, especially when you have turf grass, especially when you have an irrigation system that has not been set up properly. And so everything that was in this landscape, everything that has been done to this landscape, I'm talking about herbicides, pesticides, all of these things are now have the possibility to be washed down the storm drain to the ocean. And so it's definitely something to consider when we go forward with our activities. And that is why, we're even here today talking about ocean-friendly gardens. And here are some very specific ways that we affect local waterways. You can see in this image, there is a landscaper spraying some kind of, pesticide probably. And everything we do on land as a landscaper or just a human is going to be entered into the water cycle. And so in this particular image, she's spraying the pesticide. There's going to be some leaching that happens. And so the plant is likely not going to be able to take up all the material, especially if it's kind of used haphazardly. And then it's going to be leached into the groundwater, which is a waterway that's going to be connected to the ocean, or it's going to volatilize and then also be entered into the water cycle by the way of water vapor. So everything we do is going to be put into the water cycle. And so that's why it's kind of important to consider every action you take. So stormwater is a natural part of the water cycle. It rains. Not all of the water can be leached into the ground when the aquifer is full. And so some of it's going to run off. And it's up to us to control what is in that runoff. And while that is unavoidable, it is, you can avoid irrigation runoff. So properly irrigating, not over irrigating, which is a very, very common happenstance, that's avoidable. Using drip irrigation, all of these things are ways to avoid irrigation runoff. Another way is to have permeable surfaces, and permeable surfaces are a huge part of ocean-friendly gardens. And that will reduce the amount of water that is leaving your garden, whatever landscape, that is potentially harmful to get to our local waterways. So what are permeable surfaces? And so all of the images, all of the things labeled, these are permeable surfaces. I mean, impermeable surfaces, excuse me. These are surfaces where the water cannot leach into the ground and reach the groundwater. And so, you know, this very common house and this very common situation where we have unmulched areas, the roof, rain gutters, a concrete pathway, asphalt, a driveway, the street. All of these are impermeable surfaces where the water only has the choice to go down the storm drain. And that's a huge missed opportunity because all of that water that we get from a rain event or irrigation, we need to be using every drop of that water for its intended purpose. So we influence the amount of water running off a landscape. And so, you know, how are we irrigating? How often are we irrigating? You know, where's the water coming from? All of these things we are influencing the amount. What kind of plants are we using? So we have to irrigate so much. You know, is there a turf grass surface? Is our irrigation system running properly? So we influence the amount of water running off a landscape. We also influence the quality of the water running off a landscape. So if you think about it, you know, all of these things that we put into the landscape, fertilizers, oils from the machines that we use, pesticides, debris, all of these things are influencing the quality of the water that will eventually run off the landscape to the waterway to reach the ocean. And water running off the landscape is not inherently harmless, and it'll pick up many things along the way. As the water's, you know, rolling down the street to the storm drain, it's picking up everything else, the oil from the cars, paint, all kind of things, pet debris, soap, if you're washing your car, all of these things are reaching the ocean. That is just adding to that pollution problem that we need to deal with. And so ocean-friendly gardens use natural watersheds as a model. And basically a watershed is an area of land that collects and drains water from high points to low points. And so basically watersheds are very important when we're talking about local waterways. And a watershed is not just necessarily a designated place, but you know, we can create small watersheds all around us to hold water. And so you can see in this image, we have this high point and you have the precipitation that's coming down. And then basically the water that will percolate into the ground to reach the water table. But then all the extra water, the runoff, will reach the low point and it will stay in that area. And when it can, it'll percolate more into the groundwater. But then also the water can be evapotranspirated right at the point. And so that keeps the water in that area, and it is an important concept. So we're not having as many runoff events. And it also, the soil is healthy, it has water, and in cases like this, you probably wouldn't have to add a lot of supplemental irrigation at all. And so to compare the watershed model and a conventional landscape, basically, so let's start with the conventional landscape. You have these impermeable surfaces, so, driveways, concrete walkways, and all that stuff. And so in a rain event, the water will simply run off the property. And then, a typical landscape usually has some kind of turf grass, and, turf grass soil oftentimes gets compacted under there. And so, that's just leading to further runoff. If the soil is compacted, the water can't percolate into the aquifer and it will also run off. So it's, double runoff situations happening from the impermeable surfaces and the compacted soil. And then if we look at a watershed-wise landscape, which is what ocean-friendly gardens use, we have our permeable surface, and so the water will stay on the property because the water can now reach through these surfaces and drain down to the aquifer and replenish the aquifer, which the plant's roots can take in, and it also is creating this healthy soil ecosystem. You have your compost and your mulch, and all of these things are protecting the soil. So the soil, you have this nice, healthy living soil. And that is the main difference right there. We're protecting our soil and we're keeping as much water as we can on the property so that we do not have to add that much more supplemental irrigation to runoff. So we're saving water, we're reducing runoff. And there's this great book that is out. It's called California Watersheds Landscape Design. It's gaining popularity. It is put together by a group of organizations. The Surfrider Foundation is involved in it. But here's an example of a watershed in a landscape. And you can see that it's similar to, the natural watershed where we have high and low points. And the water from the high points will seep into the low points, and so now we have this water that is staying on the property, while if it was all flat, all of this water would likely drain down the street and eventually reach the waterways. And so this is super beneficial because these plants have water available to them, the soil is nice and healthy. And it's not a totally new concept. This approach has been used in, many designs. There are these types of gardens called rain gardens, and rain gardens are basically these small areas in whatever larger garden to do the exact same thing. Rain gardens are said to capture 30% more water than the landscape would if it did not have a rain garden. You can see this rain garden is in the middle of a turf grass lawn. And while, it's turf grass, but we have this rain garden, so we are preserving some of the water that was, from a storm event or irrigation. And that concept of a rain garden has just been kind of flipped. Instead of just having a rain garden in the middle of a turf grass surface, we have a rain garden applied to the whole area. And so it's all about retention. And retention is one of the main concepts of an ocean-friendly garden. And that leads me to the principles of CPR. So the C stands for conservation of water, energy, and habitat. The P stands for permeability of soil and surfaces, lets the water slow down and sink in. And you can see a permeable surface here, right? Instead of just a concrete walkway, it has these permeable pavers, and so the water can seep in between. And then of course retention, which is linked to the watershed approach, where we have retention of the rainwater and prevention of runoff. And so ocean-friendly gardens are an alternative to traditional landscaping. Some of the features: native plants, building healthy soils, slowing landscapes to retain water, so slowing down the water movement, reducing urban runoff and filtering out pollutants, conserving water and creating a wildlife habitat. That is linked to the native plants. If we have native plants, we also get native insects. We get food for native birds and other animals. And we're also reducing carbon emissions. So these gardens require less maintenance. So, you're not using a lawnmower every week. You're not having to even visit these gardens every week. Most times the maintenance is once a month. And so your carbon emissions are going to be reduced. Also in, far off ways where if you're not using a chemical fertilizer that has been made in a factory, that's reducing carbon emissions as well. So West Basin has a group of ocean-friendly demonstration gardens, and the purpose of these gardens are for the public and other landscape developers to have a way to come and see what an ocean-friendly garden can truly be. And there are several locations all around the South Bay, Southern California area. There is the Donald L. Deere building in Carson that was established in 2009. There is the Edward C. Little Water Recycling Facility in El Segundo that was also established in 2009. There's Malibu Bluffs Park, 2013. The Strand in the Manhattan Beach, 2013. The Robert Frost Auditorium in Culver City, which was established in 2014. The Hermosa Beach Community Center in Hermosa Beach, 2014. The Rowley Park in Gardena in 2015, and the Carson Community Center in 2013. And those are the gardens that we as Swayzer Landscapes maintain, but there are also several other gardens in the area that are used as demonstration gardens with the same values in mind, that we need to show the public that an ocean-friendly garden can be this, and it can look good, and it can be in a public space, and it's not a nuisance. And so some of the features that these ocean-friendly gardens are going to have: drip irrigation, permeable pathways, like I showed earlier, the use of succulent plants, mulch. Mulch is very important in keeping that water in the soil and not evaporating. Runoff capture, so that is using our watershed approach. California natives, we have so many California natives, so it's good to see them being used in landscaping. Smart controllers, so smart irrigation controllers that can sense the amount of precipitation and also things like humidity, and so they can turn off if it's raining to not waste water. And of course, the use of recycled water. It's very beneficial to have the ability to use recycled water in these gardens because you're not using water that can be used for human consumption. And the numbers speak for themselves. This display is from a project that was done at Santa Monica College that was comparing garden to garden. So comparing a sustainable garden to a traditional mow and blow landscape. And so when we say mow and blow, we're talking about a garden where there's turf grass and you have to go mow it, and then you use a blower to blow the grass clippings away. And so a traditional landscape would be using 57,000 gallons of water. There would be 670 pounds of yard waste, so grass clippings, all these things that are not recycled back into the landscape. And then 80 hours of maintenance, because if you have grass, no matter what kind of grass it is. You're gonna have to maintain it. You're gonna have to mow it. You're gonna have to do edging. You're gonna have to adjust the irrigation. So all of these things. And this is based on 1 year of maintaining a traditional landscape. And then if we shift to a sustainable landscape, 6,000 gallons of water, which is much less, 250 pounds of yard waste, and then 15 hours of maintenance. And that's because a lot of times these native plants, they can pretty much, do their own things. If you're ever grown a succulent, you know that you don't need to take care of it as much as you would a turf grass yard. And so much less maintenance is involved in these gardens. And if you want more resources on ocean-friendly gardens, there actually is a book out about ocean-friendly gardens, how to guide and how to, get one started and the materials that you would need, and that's by Douglas Kent. And then there's another book called California Friendly, which you can actually get for free online, and it's a maintenance guide. A lot about California natives, and so that's a good place to start if you're looking to pick some out. And then, of course, the Surfrider organization, they have a whole section of ocean-friendly gardens, lots of resources, lots of materials. And then, of course, West Basin, if you want to learn more about the demonstration gardens that there are around the Southern California area. Okay, so now we'll talk about the criteria for ocean-friendly garden plants. So one piece of criteria is non-invasive. And so it's very important that you use non-invasive plants. There is a website called plantright.org, I believe, and they list the invasive plants, and the list is constantly changing. There's so many plants that, maybe 10 years ago were planted everywhere, and, everyone thought they were the best plant ever, and now it is acting in an invasive way and it's crowding out all of the local plants. And so that's definitely something to consider. You also want to use climate appropriate plants, so plants that are suited to our particular environment in Southern California, unless they're edible. You want to group them by water needs. You don't want to put, a plant that has very low water needs next to a plant that has medium to high water needs, because, one of the plants is not going to get its needs met. You also want to have a diverse selection. Very often we see, non-diverse landscapes. You see the same plants repeated over and over, and that's not something that is good for ocean-friendly gardens. You want to have at least 10% of native plants. Living in Southern California, we can definitely do better than that because there are so many native plants that are available to us, but you want to have at least 10%. And no turf grass or kept at a minimum. And if you do have turf grass, you definitely want to do grass cycling, where you take the clippings and you leave them on the grass so they can eventually break down, and those nutrients from those grass clippings can go back into the soil. So, if you must have grass, that is one of the requirements. And so first, we'll talk about native plants. And like I kind of mentioned, California is a biodiversity hotspot. We have more native plants than any other state. There are about 6,500 native species that are available for us to use and garden with. And that's a large amount, and they range from anything from succulents to trees, herbaceous plants, everything in between. And it's important to use native plants because they have evolved over time to thrive in this particular environment. And you can see in this image, and this image is not necessarily for California native plants, but the same concept applies. And so we have these plants like hydrangeas, fountain grasses, daylilies, whatever, turf grass. Those are commonly used in landscapes all over the country, and they're not native to here. And so we kind of have to change our environment so that these plants can thrive in it, because they're not from locations that may be as hot or has, such a low amount of rainfall per year. versus a native plant, it has evolved in this environment. And so it has learned to deal with the soil types, the amount of water. And so native plants in California, they may root deeper because they know that they're not going to have a rain event, every few days. And so they dig deeper because they know they need to get to the groundwater. And so in turn, we would have to irrigate them less because they are so suited towards our environment. Also climate appropriate plants. And so when you're choosing the plants for this California ocean friendly garden, you can check the USDA plant hardiness zone map, and it basically groups the entire country in 11 zones, and the zones are based on the average minimum temperature of that area for a certain amount of time. There's another way to check your climate appropriateness, and that's to use the sunset climate zones. It's a little bit more holistic, if you will. It considers the climate as a whole, so it looks at the amount of rainfall, the timing of that rainfall, the humidity, the highs, and the low temperatures. And so sunset climate zones is becoming one of landscapers and gardeners and nurseries more used zone map of plant appropriateness. And so you can just go on sunset climate zones, you can Google that, and then you can find out whatever plant you're looking for. You can find out exactly what zone it can grow in. And you can see in this map how the zones are laid out and how they differ, even when, there's cities that are close to each other, like, Long Beach and Lakewood are pretty close to each other, but they're in separate zones. And so there are plants that may be more climate appropriate in Long Beach that are not as climate appropriate in Lakewood. And this information is usually found on a kind of, a plant tag. So if you're in a nursery and they have the little tag in it, it usually tells you the hardiness zones. But like I said, you can also Google this information to find out about whatever exact plant you're looking for. You also want to group plants by microclimates, and so microclimates and relative water needs. So spaces in the landscape, a microclimate is a space in the landscape that's going to have a temperature and climate that is significantly different from its surroundings, and that is usually due to other things, like maybe there's a house right here or there's a wall right here. And so it's kind of split into full sun, partial sun, and shade. And so you want to be, thinking about where these plants will thrive best. And also you want to group them by water use, because like I said earlier, you don't want a plant that is high water use. You don't want a thirsty grass plant right next to a group of succulents, because one plant is going to suffer. And it's usually the succulents, because you'll water the grass and then the succulents will be overwatered and they'll start to fail. And so you definitely want to consider that, grouping them by microclimate. Also, a diverse selection of plants. If you have a diverse selection of plants, you reduce maintenance costs by lowering the need for fertilizers, fuels, and pesticides. Far too often in our landscapes, we end up what we call a monoculture, and it's not even just on one landscape site. It ends up, pretty much landscapes wide in Southern California. You'll see the same plants over and over and over again, and at any given time, there's about 10 different species that are being used so much over and over and over. And then you'll just have like, a group of shrubs that are all the same, group of trees that are all the same. And it's very common, but you don't want to do that, because that can lead you to a bad situation where if there is a pest or something that is killing these plants, or if the environmental is not suited for these plants at whatever given moment, all of these plants will fail because they're all the same. And so then you would have to recoup, figuring out how to replace all of these plants, when if you had a diverse layout like an ocean friendly garden does, If one plant is dealing with a pest problem, it's likely not to affect all the plants around it. And so you kind of save on pesticide costs in that way. Also, it takes much more fuel and man hours to maintain a group of shrubs that are kept as hedges versus, a more natural looking landscape. And then you also want to consider the function of the plant that it's going to play in the landscape. So in landscape design, the plants can serve several functions. Is it architectural? Is it a border? Is it, hiding something you don't want to see? All of these things take into play. Is it, providing curb appeal? Is it, you know, privacy? Also engineering. So is this plant providing erosion control? Is it on a hill? That's something to consider when you're choosing plants, because not every plant can provide erosion control. And then what are the environmental functions? So is this plant serving as a windbreak? Is it providing shade? All of these things need to be considered when you are deciding what types of plants are going to be going in your ocean-friendly garden. Also, it has to be aesthetically pleasing. That's something that can oftentimes be forgotten when you're talking about all of these ocean-friendly gardens and all this stuff. It has to be aesthetically pleasing because by definition they are ornamental gardens, and so they have to be something that look better or look as good as what a traditional landscape can provide. So it is enticing for people to want to look at them and visit them and enjoy them. And right here, I'm showing the planting plan of the garden in Gardena Raleigh Park. And this is to show that all of this has been thought out. So as the gardens, as they stand now, the demonstration gardens for West Basin, everything has been considered. The watershed approach, the aesthetic appeal, the native plants, all of this has been put into play. And so it's our job as people who maintain them, or whatever the case, to make sure that we uphold the values that have been very much thought out and put into these gardens. I'm going to
Yeah, I actually can take over for a quick second, Llewellyn. I did have a question come in that I kind of was thinking as you were reviewing. You did a great job touching on the conversation about why ocean-friendly gardens are important. And one question that I had that relates to that and the maintenance of it is, is there anything that staff that are maintaining these type of garden that they should focus on when they prepare for a storm? So, we hear of the storm events and we understand the importance of ocean-friendly gardens in kind of trapping that water and really avoiding the runoff that you mentioned during the beginning of your slides. Is there any tasks specifically that staff and maintenance staff should focus, maybe if they know that there's going to be a significant amount of rain falling upon the ocean-friendly garden, like moving mulch or being aware of puddling or anything of that sense? I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first and foremost, I would say make sure the mulch is replenished and there, because that is one of the leading features that will help retain the moisture for the soil. But also, these landscapes have been designed, they have been carved out to hold water, because retention is a huge part of ocean-friendly gardens, and they're not a high maintenance garden. So you can kind of, sit back a little bit and watch the watershed fill up, and there's nothing you can really do after that fact. Just making sure the plants are healthy. You have those plants that are on the border that probably were there perhaps to catch water. You want to make sure your watershed is free of weeds and debris, so that it can work to its best ability. And of course the mulch, make sure it's, replenished and you have your, your 3 to 5 inches of mulch that are there and present.
Great, and that's kind of a preview to one of the other webinars that is coming. I think one of them you'll completely dedicate to mulch, but I just thought of that question as you were reviewing the benefits of ocean-friendly gardens, so thank you for that. Aside from that question, I don't see any in the chat and no other further questions on my end, so we can kind of move on with the webinar.
Okay. So now we'll talk about the lifespan of ocean-friendly garden plants. Obviously, I can talk about the lifespan of every plant that can go in an ocean-friendly garden. I chose a few that I know are present in the gardens and probably relate to other plants. And then after that, we'll talk about the plant replacement schedule. So of course, trees. There are going to be trees in the landscape. There need to be trees in the landscape. And one of the trees that is often planted in this landscape is the strawberry tree. It is a medium-sized tree and it has a very long longevity, so 50 to 150 years. And so, yes, planting a small one is making a commitment for a long time. But another thing about these gardens, especially if you want to start one or if you're maintaining one currently, you may notice that there are some trees in the landscape that are not, California natives or even, super, low water use. And that's because trees do have a long longevity. So just because you have an ocean-friendly garden doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to take out all the trees that were existing there. And so that may be an occurrence that happens, but in general, trees don't need a huge amount of water, especially on a daily basis or even a weekly basis. And so it's not something to worry about that much if you have trees that are not suited towards, the ocean-friendly garden criteria. And then, of course, this is a California native. We have Santa Cruz Island ironwood. It's a very unique tree, and it has a longevity to from 50 to 150 years. And I know this garden is in the garden at the Hermosa Beach Community Center. It's a very nice specimen. And so because it is native, it does, suit the climate and all of that. But, it doesn't need a lot of water, just like most trees won't need a huge amount of irrigation, especially once they are established and not small trees anymore. Some other trees present, the western redbud, which is, there's also one of these trees at the Hermosa Beach Community Center, 50 to 75 years. It has wonderful flowers, wonderful bark, the leaves are nice. And then the coast live oak, which is native here, it has longevity of more than 150 years, so a long living tree. They can get pretty large, but it is native. And so these are some of the trees that are present. And so when we're talking about lifespan and longevity, we're kind of like not putting trees in that equation because they're going to be there, and their trees are usually something that we work around in whatever landscape that we're in. And we'll touch on, of course, pruning and all those kind of practices in another webinar. So to start, we'll talk about sedges. And so sedges, there's many sedges. There's probably sedges at every garden, and specifically field sedge and dune sedge. They have a longevity of a very long time. They can live for a very, very long time. They're very hardy grasses. Lots of research has gone into these grasses, and they've been making their rounds as a turf grass replacement, in the landscaping community. One thing that will happen is they will, start to get a little ragged looking, especially, if they've been subjected to too much water. The centers might turn brown of the grass. And so one thing you can do is cut them back, about 6 to 3 inches from the ground. And that will rejuvenate them. And so eventually they'll grow back and they'll become full again. But it is a very vigorous sedge. And so you will likely, instead of even having to cut it back a lot, you would probably end up more corralling it. Because these grasses are a lot of times surrounding the watershed features, it's likely that you will have to remove parts of the grass or remove pieces of the grass plant, like digging it up and physically removing a piece of it so that it does not go into the watershed feature, because if it did, it would lessen the watershed feature's ability to collect water in an effective way. And so these are field sedges and dune sedges, which are similar to grasses. And then we have grasses, and so deer grass and muhly grass are used a lot in these particular types of grasses for the same function, really. They have a longevity of about 15 years. And you'll notice when they're getting older, especially for the muhly grass, which is Muhlenbergia capillaris, the flowers will, not be as prolific. The leaves won't stand up as much. The centers will turn brown. And so you'll notice that the plant is, getting towards the end of its life cycle, or it's not in the best conditions. And so another thing with these longevities, they vary because they vary depending on the environment that the plants are subjected in. These longevities are usually best case scenarios. So these plants have had, conditions that they like, but there's also events where there can be too much moisture, and that can cause the longevity to go down. The soil can be too dry, not enough nutrients. All these things can reduce longevity. So every 3 years, these plants should be divided because they are going to get rather large. In the process of dividing them, I'll talk about in another lecture when we talk about pruning and whatnot. But basically, you dig up the plant, you try to get as many roots as you can, and then you just chop, this huge mass in half, and then you could plant one, plant two, so now you have 2 plants. And that's a good way to, get more plant material if you need it, but also make sure that they don't get too large, because when they get too large, the leaves in the middle, they will stay moist for longer after irrigation and eventually start rotting. And then we have breeze grass, which is also a, a nice turf grass replacement, Lomandria longifolia. The plants are very, very long lived. They have been through extensive plant breeding. They're not native to California. They're actually native to Australia, but they are well suited for our environment and constantly used in drought tolerant landscapes. There's no need to cut them back annually, even though some people do, because they want a neater look. And they want them to stay kind of in their range and small, but you don't necessarily need to cut them back annually, so that is less maintenance already there. But cutting them back after 4 to 6 years will help, add shape, and it will also help keep them vigorous. Many of these plants, especially these ornamental horticultural plants, they have been bred and they've evolved basically to be maintained. So it is important that we do maintain them, we not just leave them there, because they kind of need that boost of that the old blades to be cut off and to push out new blades, and that helps them stay looking how they're supposed to look. And then now moving on to shrubs. So yarrow is also a very popular plant that's used in ocean-friendly gardens. California native. Longevity is pretty short though, so about 5 years, even shorter if it's been subjected to wet areas. And then that also says if an area is especially shady, and it receives irrigation, it's going to stay wet for longer, so that also will, add to that shorter lifespan. It makes beautiful flowers. It comes in various colors: yellow, pink, white, red. But something that needs to happen, they need to be cut back hard every 3 to 5 years to help that longevity. And so I say 3 to 5 years, even though they only live 5 years, because if you cut them back to the ground, they'll rejuvenate and you'll basically get like a brand new plant out of it. And so sometimes this happens very oftenly. You'll walk up on a yarrow plant and you'll see all of the woody, hard, twiggy stems under there. What needs to happen is this plant simply needs to just be cut back because it's entering the end of its longevity, and it needs to be cut back so that it can replenish and rejuvenate itself and start again. Versus looking like this, full of flowers, and this one's all rangy and twiggy. Another plant that we have in the landscapes is a shrub called coffee berry. It has a very long longevity, so it definitely needs to be considered when you're placing it in the garden. And when you have it in your garden, the longevity is 100 to 200 years, so just more than our lifetimes. And it can get very large, 15 feet tall, 15 feet wide. It can just get crazy. And so it's important that we'll talk about specific methods, but it does need to be pruned to maintain size. Because it lives for so long, you can't, ignore it. You need to be constantly thinking like, okay, it's been 1 year, it's been 2 years, it's been 3 years. I need to do something so that I keep it, in this area. Given you can plant it, with enough space to grow 15 feet wide, 15 feet tall, but if that's not something that's desired, then it does need to be pruned. And then there's salvias. There's so many salvias in the gardens, California natives. They have a longevity about 10 years, and I say about 10 years because there's so many different species, there's so many hybrids that are used in these particular gardens, so many natives. There's about 7 that can be used in these gardens. And so what needs to happen, in that span of 10 years to reach that 10 years in the first place, they need to be cut back to a third or half of its plant needs to be cut back to maintain that shape. And this is on a yearly basis because they can grow large and spread and mass, and you can't, even though these are low maintenance gardens, you do want to maintain them. You do want to keep the plants in their designated space. You don't want them to look too wild and unkept, especially since these are demonstration gardens and we are trying to demonstrate, how nice they can look. Then ceanothus is also many different species, and there's many hybrids that are available to use for these gardens. Longevity is about 10 to 15 years, and they make these beautiful, cute little flowers. But once they start getting older, the older branches will not react well to pruning, and so it's kind of important, especially in the younger parts of the longevity of these plants. And also consider, when we're talking about longevity, consider the date, the inception of this garden, because it's likely to be the original plant. So if the garden was established, in 2013, it's, getting close to the 10-year mark. And so older branches do not react well to pruning. So the rule with ceanothus is when the branch is about the diameter of a pencil, that's when it's not going to react well to pruning. And so when they are young and when you have a lot of the soft herbaceous growth, you want to make sure you are pruning it so that the shape is maintained, and not a strict shape. You want it to be a free flowing natural shape, but you want to try to keep the size that you want. And that's very important. But once it gets to a certain point, especially in that 15-year mark, this plant is 15 years old, and you have a lot of older wood on it, it's probably getting closer time to replace it, because you cannot just prune it and expect for good things to happen. And then coyote bush, it's at the Manhattan Beach Garden. The longevity about 10 to 15 years. It's a very manageable plant. It's mainly made up of soft herbaceous stems, and so what you can do is just trim it back as needed to keep it from getting too rangy or stick looking. And so it likely will need to be corralled in a way, especially if it's close to the border or the watershed feature. And so you'll have it for about 10 to 15 years. And so on, probably during its growing period on a monthly basis is something you need to look at and see, is it getting too large? And then of course, succulents. Succulents are a huge part of these gardens, and they're, used constantly. And so importantly, they need to be with other plants that have low water use. So that is a piece of the criteria. And I mention that because many of these plants I've seen in gardens, and not California friendly, ocean friendly gardens, but just regular traditional landscape gardens, and they'll be too close to overhead irrigation, kind of like in this picture, right? You'll see this grass. I mean, this succulent is very close to turf grass, and that's not really a good situation for the succulents. And so the top one is a coral aloe. The second one is a live forever Dudleya, and then these are blue chalk sticks. The only one that is native to California is the Dudleya, but they are low water use, so they do follow that drought tolerant criteria. The longevity of the aloe can be from 5 to 25 years, and that's a large range, I know, but it really depends on the care that is put into this aloe. They will live much shorter if they receive too much moisture. Dudleya, 50 to 100 years, so really long time. And then chalk sticks from 20 to 50 years. And succulents are not something you really have to worry too much about because they will produce what we call pups or offsets. And so you can see that here in this picture. This plant is producing many little pups, and the same thing with blue chalk sticks. When it grows, it'll just produce more and more and more, and it eventually spread and fill in whatever area you have. And so it's likely when you get old ones, you can just, when the center plant gets old, you can just remove it. Or when they flower, you can just cut off the dead flowers if you want, but it's not totally necessary. So succulents are very low maintenance, and they're known as low maintenance for these reasons. And then the last are going to be annuals. And so California poppies are pretty much the only annual that are used in these gardens, because annuals are kind of known to be they're not necessarily drought tolerant all the time, and they are not wasteful, but they do take more energy from landscapers. And so California poppies are native to California, and so they require very little additional resources. So Schlogia californica, that's also our state flower. Since they're annuals, the longevity is going to be 1 year, obviously. But if you have them in your garden, they are going to reseed very easily. So basically, right now, actually, they should be growing out from the seeds that were in the soil. And then after the flowering is all done, you'll have this seed pod, and then it'll break open and it'll drop the seeds in the soil, and so the seeds will be there for the next season. They can become a little weedy though, because they drop so many seeds, and so they will You'll probably have to pick out several plants if they're going over the border or whatever the case. But the cool thing is that they'll come back next year because the seeds are there. So it's not necessarily something that you have to go out and plant every year. But the seeds will be there, especially if you had them once. And I mentioned a lot of plants, and a huge part of landscaping and horticulture is plant identification. And plant identification can be a difficult task, but there are a lot of resources that can help, especially with California natives. I think, it's more likely that we learn typical landscape plants or food plants and not California natives. And so there are some resources that can help. There's plantid.net where they can, you can pick many different things. You can pick the leaf size and the shape and the color of the flower, and they can help you find out what exactly the plant is. There is a great book from Matt Ritter, which is called California Plants, and it can be used to help identify plants as well. There's another book that I like. It's called The Drought-Defying California Garden, which has a lot of plants that can be potentially used in these landscapes, and can also help you identify the plants that are in your current landscape. California Native Plants for the Garden, also a great book that has many resources to help with plant identification. And then there's also this app, it's called PlantNet. It's a community source app basically where people can submit their pictures and help confirm, but it's a very large community. So, especially the app started a long time ago, so you can, download the app, you take a picture of a plant on your phone, and it'll scour through the database, thousands and thousands of pictures, and it can help you identify it and then narrow it down if anything, and you can find out what the plant is. Because it's important to know exactly what the plant is, because then you can enter the conversation of longevity. Then you can enter the conversation of, how this plant should be cared for and pruned and what are the water needs and all of that. I'm gonna take questions at this time if there are any.
Hi, Jennifer here. I haven't received any questions, and yeah, so you're free to kind of go on with the rest of the webinar.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so now finishing out, we'll talk about the plant replacement schedule. So a common question that we need to ask when we're talking about plant replacement, do we have to replace it or can we rejuvenate it? And so in this image is a very, very twiggy ceanothus plant. They eventually get like this at some point when they're getting closer to the end of their lives or they've been pruned too heavily. And so for this one, this, in my opinion, is an obvious replacement. You cannot rejuvenate it because the stems are thick and old and they will not react well to pruning. And so it's likely that many of the stems will never produce leaves again. And so this is a case of replacement, but there are going to be some cases where rejuvenation is the answer. So for grasses, I mentioned it, grasses and sedges, I mentioned it a little earlier that you can divide grasses, and dividing grasses is a form of rejuvenation that can take place. And so basically what you do is you cut the grasses back pretty hard, and so you can see this one has been cut back, and then you dig out as many of the roots as you can, and you simply cut it in half, and then you can replant it. And so now you have two plants and they're smaller, and the plant is rejuvenated and it will grow back and be healthy. And you want to do this in the late winter or early spring. You don't want to do it too too early in the winter, because if we do have a frost event, so if the temperature drops too low, then the plant will potentially die because it doesn't have the capacity or frost damage. If you are doing plant replacement, because rejuvenation is not an option, you want to do it from late fall to late winter. And that's because the plants that are native to California, that is when they're normally used to receiving their water. And so that's likely when we'll have rain. And so when you plant new plants, they are going to need supplemental irrigation. And so a way to, use as little supplemental water as you can, and depend on the rain, is to do them at this time. And so if you are not in the late fall, late winter, there are steps you can take to prepare for the replacement. So removing the old plant, you want to remove it as soon as possible because you want to start getting the soil ready to for the new plant. Apply compost and then apply mulch on top of that. You also can take this time to redirect your drip lines, and so consider that this plant is going to be smaller, and then where you're going to put the plant. So you want the plant to be right, you want the drip line to be right at the base. And you also want to keep the area moist, and so that's why you want that drip line to be there. So when the drip irrigation is on, it'll be providing moisture to that area. So once you are ready to put your plant in the ground, it can start off right, healthy, and thriving. Finding a replacement can be a little difficult. Even though they are California natives, some of them are a little difficult to find. So even if you got your site planned and you knew exactly what was there, exactly what species, exactly what cultivar was there, you may not be able to find it. And so the first thing I would do is I would check my local nurseries for availability. So whatever they have that would fit the criteria for an ocean-friendly garden plant. And then I would check the water use classification of the landscape species. So Wallcoast is this very great website, and they have a whole plant database. So basically what you do is you enter the city of where your garden is, then you enter the plant name that you may have found at the nursery, and then you can see what the water use is. I would also compare it to the plants that are immediately next to it, so to make sure that they're aligned. So I want to make sure if I'm using, if I found a plant at a local nursery that is low water use, and if it's all the other criteria of an ocean friendly garden, I want to make sure that the plants next to it are also low water use. So I'm not, changing things too much and lowering the efficiency of the ocean friendly garden, or perhaps putting the rest of the plants in a situation where they will be receiving too much water or too little water. And to conclude our ocean friendly garden maintenance webinar series on plant lifespan and replacement schedules, so first, identify the plants currently in your garden. So you can do that with those multiple resources that I gave you, and also that app. You could also look at the site plan. Although some of those plants that were in the initial site plan may not be there in the actual garden because of an availability issue. Pay attention to signs of aging in plants. If you have grasses, they're turning brown in the center, they may need to be rejuvenated. You're seeing, oh, this is looking twiggy. Your yarrow is not flowering as prolifically. These are signs of aging that you should pay attention to and figure out what action you want to take. Then question, is it a rejuvenation event or is it a replacement event? For the grasses, rejuvenation will usually be the right thing to do for those situations, but then there's other times where replacement is what you need to do. When you're replacing plants, of course, consider the criteria for ocean friendly garden plants, and so you want to make sure that the plant fits the specs of what an ocean friendly garden plant should be. And then when you are replacing plants, you want to make sure you do it in the late fall to late winter so that you're not having to go out there and provide so much supplemental irrigation to keep the small plant alive. And so that concludes our webinar for today. Here is an outline of the other webinars that we'll talk about. So next time we'll be talking about pruning schedules and then irrigation systems and management of those systems. weeding requirements, mulch requirements, and then maintenance scheduling. And they will be Thursdays at 10 a.m. So thank you for joining us today. If you have any additional questions, you can email me or Jennifer. I'll also entertain any questions now if there are any that need to be answered.